On the night of April 26, 1986, the world changed forever. At the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, an explosion ripped through Reactor 4, releasing massive amounts of radiation into the atmosphere. The disaster unfolded in a matter of seconds, but its consequences would last for generations. What was meant to be a routine safety test turned into one of the worst nuclear accidents in human history, a catastrophe so severe that its effects are still being felt today. The Chernobyl power plant was part of the Soviet Union's push for nuclear energy, a symbol of technological progress. Located near the city of Pripyat, the plant housed 4 operational reactors, with 2 more under construction at the time of the disaster. Reactor 4, the one that would explode, had been in operation for just 3 years. The plant used RBMK reactors, a Soviet design that had serious flaws that were ignored for the sake of rapid expansion. The accident occurred during a late-night test meant to determine whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. To conduct the test, operators disabled several key safety systems, something that should never have been done under normal conditions. Due to a combination of human error, poor reactor design, and a lack of proper safety protocols, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. A sudden power surge led to 2 massive explosions, blowing off the reactor's heavy steel and concrete lid. Flames shot into the night sky, and within moments, a deadly cloud of radioactive material was released. The force of the explosion was so powerful that pieces of the reactor were hurled across the plant grounds. Firefighters, unaware of the radiation exposure, rushed to the scene to battle the flames. Many of them had no protective gear, and within minutes of arriving, they began experiencing severe symptoms of radiation poisoning, dizziness, vomiting, and intense burns. The graphite from the reactor core burned fiercely, and as the fire raged, radioactive particles were carried by the wind, spreading across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, the Soviet government initially downplayed the severity of the explosion. Pripyat, a city built to house the plant's workers and their families, was not immediately evacuated. For over 36 hours, residents continued their daily lives, completely unaware that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Children played outside, families attended school and work, and life went on as if nothing had happened. It wasn't until radiation levels spiked in Sweden nearly 1,000 miles away that the world realized something was terribly wrong. By the time the Soviet government acknowledged the disaster, the damage had already been done. Pripyat was finally evacuated on April 27th, but by then thousands of people had already been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Buses lined the streets as residents were ordered to leave immediately, taking only what they could carry. Many never returned. The city, once a thriving community, became a ghost town overnight, abandoned in a desperate attempt to escape the invisible threat that lingered in the air. As the Soviet authorities scrambled to contain the disaster, the full scale of what had happened was only beginning to be understood. The explosion had not just devastated the reactor, it had created an ongoing crisis that would require massive resources and human sacrifice to control. The response in the days and weeks ahead would determine how much worse the situation would become, and for those who remained at the plant, the danger was far from over. In the chaotic hours following the explosion at Reactor 4, Soviet officials struggled to grasp the full extent of the disaster. The immediate priority was to extinguish the raging fires and prevent further explosions, but the situation was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. With radiation levels climbing to lethal amounts, every decision carried life or death consequences. The first responders, many of whom were local firefighters, had unknowingly walked into a death trap. They had been called to the scene, believing it was a routine industrial fire, unaware that they were stepping into one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Without protective gear, they fought the flames with water, completely exposed to the intense radiation streaming from the destroyed reactor core. Within hours, many of them began experiencing severe symptoms: nausea, dizziness, and painful burns. Caused by radiation penetrating their bodies, some collapsed on the spot. Despite their suffering, they continued working, trying desperately to contain the disaster. Meanwhile, inside the control room of Reactor 4, plant workers struggled to understand what had happened. Many refused to believe that the reactor had exploded. It was not just denial, it was the result of years of Soviet propaganda promoting the idea that their reactors were completely safe. Some operators were ordered to manually pump cooling water into what was left of the core, exposing themselves to deadly radiation in the process. Others tried to restore power to the plant, unaware that their efforts were futile. The damage had already been done. As news of the explosion spread among Soviet leadership, there was hesitation about how to respond. The government's instinct was to cover up the severity of the situation. Officials debated whether to alert the public or keep the disaster a secret, fearing international backlash and damage to the Soviet Union's reputation. While these discussions took place behind closed doors, people in Pripyat continued their daily routines, completely unaware that invisible radioactive particles were already settling over their city. Radiation levels in and around the plant were astronomical. Readings on dosimeters, devices used to measure radiation exposure, quickly maxed out. Some devices even failed entirely due to the extreme radiation. Despite this, government officials were reluctant to acknowledge the scale of the catastrophe. Scientists who raised concerns were ignored or silenced. And it wasn't until radiation alarms at a Swedish nuclear plant detected unusual activity that the Soviet government was forced to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. Finally, more than a day after the explosion, evacuation orders were given for Pripyat. Residents were told that they had only a few hours to gather their belongings. They were reassured that they would be able to return soon, but in reality, none of them would ever see their homes again. The evacuation was rushed, with long lines of buses stretching down the roads, carrying thousands of people away from the growing nuclear crisis. The eerie silence that followed would mark the beginning of Pripyat's transformation into an abandoned city, frozen in time. Even after the residents were removed, the danger remained. The destroyed reactor was still emitting dangerous amounts of radiation, threatening to spread even further. The Soviet government now faced the impossible task of stopping an ongoing nuclear disaster with limited knowledge, outdated equipment, and workers who had no idea what they were stepping into. The next phase of the response would require unprecedented human sacrifice, as thousands of people were sent into Chernobyl's radioactive ruins to prevent an even greater catastrophe. In the days following the explosion, Soviet authorities faced an overwhelming crisis. With Reactor 4 still spewing radioactive material into the air, the priority was to contain the spread before it reached catastrophic levels. However, with radiation levels so high that even machines failed, the task fell largely to human workers, thousands of whom would later be known as the liquidators. These liquidators were made up of soldiers, firefighters, plant workers, and volunteers, many of whom had little to no understanding of the dangers they were walking into. They were tasked with clearing debris, disposing of contaminated materials, and constructing makeshift barriers to slow the release of radiation. Some were even ordered to shovel highly radioactive graphite off the reactor roof, a task so dangerous that they were only allowed to work for seconds at a time before being replaced. Even with such short exposure, many suffered from acute radiation poisoning. One of the most urgent threats was the risk of a second explosion. Below the damaged reactor, a massive pool of molten nuclear fuel was burning through the concrete foundation. If it reached the large water reservoirs beneath the plant, the resulting steam explosion could have been powerful enough to contaminate much of Europe with lethal radiation. To prevent this, a group of 3 engineers and plant workers volunteered for a near-suicidal mission, diving into the flooded basement to drain the water manually. Their efforts succeeded, preventing what could have been an even greater catastrophe. At the same time, Soviet scientists and engineers worked to construct a massive concrete structure, known as the sarcophagus, to encase the reactor and limit further radiation release. It was a rushed effort, built under extreme conditions, and it would later require major reinforcement. But at the time, it was seen as the only viable solution to stop the crisis from spiraling further out of control. As the response continued, the Soviet government finally admitted to the world that an accident had occurred. However, the full scale of the disaster was still downplayed. Only after increased radiation was detected in other countries did more details start to emerge. International pressure grew, forcing the Soviet Union to take more drastic action. Scientists and nuclear experts from around the world offered assistance, but political tensions made collaboration difficult. Meanwhile, the effects of radiation exposure were beginning to take a toll. Hospitals became overwhelmed with liquidators and first responders suffering from radiation sickness. Many of these individuals had no idea they had been exposed until symptoms appeared: burns on their skin, organ failure, and in many cases, fatal complications. Despite the growing crisis, thousands more workers were sent to continue the cleanup, some with little more than cloth masks and basic protective suits. By this point, the abandoned city of Pripyat had become a haunting reminder of the disaster. Houses, schools, and amusement parks sat untouched, frozen in time. Personal belongings were left behind as residents had expected to return. Over time, nature began reclaiming the city, but the radiation levels remained dangerously high. The Chernobyl disaster was no longer just a Soviet problem. It had become an international concern. Scientists and world leaders debated how to prevent similar disasters in the future, but the full consequences of Chernobyl were still unfolding. The disaster's impact on human health, the environment, and even politics would continue to grow in the months and years ahead. As the months passed, the full scale of the Chernobyl disaster became clearer. The radiation released into the environment was not just a local problem. It spread across vast regions, carried by the wind and contaminating land, water, and food supplies far beyond the borders of Ukraine. Belarus, in particular, suffered heavily, with large portions of its farmland becoming unsafe due to radioactive fallout. Even areas in Western Europe detected elevated radiation levels, forcing some countries to take drastic measures, such as banning the sale of contaminated food products. One of the most alarming long-term consequences was the impact on human health. While many of the liquidators and first responders suffered immediate effects from radiation exposure, the true cost of the disaster would be measured over generations. Increased cases of thyroid cancer, particularly in children, became one of the most well-documented health effects. This was largely due to the release of radioactive iodine, which was absorbed by the thyroid gland through contaminated milk and other food sources. In response, medical studies were launched to track the long-term health effects of radiation exposure, with scientists trying to understand how deeply Chernobyl had altered human DNA. Birth defects, immune system disorders, and other illnesses were reported among populations exposed to high levels of radiation, but the full impact remains debated to this day. The Soviet government and later the Ukrainian government set up programs to provide compensation and healthcare to victims, but resources were often limited. Meanwhile, the long and complicated process of decontaminating the affected areas had begun. Entire villages were abandoned with buildings demolished and soil removed in an attempt to reduce radiation levels. In some cases, entire forests were bulldozed and buried because the trees had absorbed dangerous amounts of radiation. The exclusion zone, covering thousands of square miles around the plant, became a permanent no-go area with only a few elderly residents choosing to return despite the risks. Wildlife in the exclusion zone also faced major consequences. Many animals showed signs of genetic mutations, while others, including birds and large mammals, struggled to survive in the altered environment. Over time, however, something unexpected happened. Nature began to reclaim the abandoned land. With no human interference, populations of wolves, bears, and other wildlife started to thrive, creating a strange paradox. An area once deemed too dangerous for humans became a haven for animals. Despite these changes, the damaged reactor remained a major concern. The hastily built sarcophagus that covered Reactor 4 was not designed to last forever, and over the years, cracks and structural weaknesses began to appear. If it collapsed, radioactive dust could once again be released into the air, causing another environmental crisis. To prevent this, an international effort was launched to build a new containment structure, one of the largest engineering projects ever undertaken. Known as the New Safe Confinement, this massive steel structure was designed to completely enclose Reactor 4 and prevent further radiation leaks. It was carefully constructed and then slid into place over the existing sarcophagus, a feat that required precise planning and execution. This new barrier was designed to last for at least a century, buying time for future generations to find a permanent solution to the dangers posed by the reactor's remains. Even with these efforts, Chernobyl remains an ongoing challenge. The disaster reshaped nuclear policy worldwide, leading to stricter safety regulations and renewed debates about the risks of nuclear power. Some countries moved away from nuclear energy entirely, while others doubled down on improving safety measures. The lessons of Chernobyl continue to influence discussions about energy, safety, and government transparency, ensuring that its legacy will not be forgotten. Decades after the Chernobyl disaster, its impact is still being felt in ways both seen and unseen. While the exclusion zone remains largely uninhabited, scientists, researchers, and even tourists visit the area to study its long-term effects and witness the eerie remains of what was once a thriving community. Pripyat, the abandoned city near to the power plant, stands frozen in time, a haunting reminder of the sudden evacuation that took place all those years ago. Buildings crumble, nature overtakes the streets, and personal belongings remained scattered as if waiting for their owners to return. Despite ongoing concerns about radiation, Chernobyl has also become a site of great interest for scientists studying how ecosystems adapt to extreme conditions. Wildlife has flourished in the absence of human activity, with some species showing resilience to radiation exposure. While mutations and shortened lifespans have been observed in certain animals, others appear to be thriving, raising new questions about nature's ability to recover from nuclear disasters. At the same time, there is still no clear solution for dealing with the long-term storage of nuclear waste from the disaster. While the new safe confinement structure provides a temporary solution for Reactor 4, the question remains what will happen when it, too, reaches the end of its lifespan. The effort to decommission the plant and safely manage its radioactive materials will continue for generations, requiring constant attention and funding. The people most affected by Chernobyl, those who were evacuated, the liquidators who risked their lives, and the families who lost loved ones, continue to fight for recognition and support. Some survivors still struggle with health problems linked to radiation exposure, while others have spent years advocating for justice and better assistance. The disaster exposed the dangers of government secrecy and the consequences of ignoring safety concerns, lessons that many believe should never be forgotten. Chernobyl also serves as a warning for the future of nuclear energy. While advances in technology have made modern reactors safer, the disaster remains a symbol of what can go wrong when human error, flawed designs, and poor decision-making collide. The event changed the way the world viewed nuclear power, leading some nations to phase it out, while others work to improve safety standards. The debate over nuclear energy's risks and benefits continues, shaped in part by the haunting legacy of Chernobyl. Though decades have passed, the Chernobyl disaster remains a powerful reminder of how one moment in history can alter the course of the future. The lessons learned from this tragedy have influenced global policies, scientific research, and public awareness about the dangers of radiation and the need for transparency in times of crisis. While efforts to contain and manage the site continue, the story of Chernobyl will always stand as a cautionary tale, one that must never be ignored or forgotten. The 100 Years' War was a conflict unlike any other in history. It wasn't just a single battle or a few years of fighting. It lasted for over 100 years, from the year 1337 to 1453. This war wasn't a single event, but a series of battles, political moves, and shifting alliances that shaped the course of history. The fighting mostly took place in Europe, and the main players were two powerful countries, England and France. The war involved not just battles between armies, but complex struggles over territories, thrones, and influence. So how did this massive war begin? The root cause of the conflict goes back to territorial disputes, particularly between England and France. The English kings had long held lands in France, including the Duchy of Guyenne, and they also had a claim to the French throne. These territories were valuable for trade and military strategy, and both sides saw them as key to their power. The English monarchy, led by King Edward III, argued that they had the right to the throne of France through their maternal bloodline. However, when the French king, Charles IV, died in 1337 without a direct male heir, the French nobility chose Philip VI of the Valois family to succeed him. This left Edward III angry and determined to press his claim. This wasn't just a fight over land and the throne. It was a war that reflected the growing power of nationalism. At the time, both England and France were still developing as unified nations, and the war played a significant role in that process. National identity, loyalty to one's country, and the idea of ruling over specific territories started to become more important. While the idea of universal monarchy like the Holy Roman Empire faded away, the war would eventually stir the rise of royal power, shifting it away from local nobles and towards stronger centralized kingdoms. Economics also played a huge role in the 100 Years' War. Both countries were trying to control lucrative trade routes, particularly in the wool industry, which was important for the English economy. For France, the vineyards and farmlands of the south were vital to their economic success, and England's control over parts of France threatened that. This economic pressure added to the tension, turning what could have been a simple dispute over territory into a much bigger and more brutal conflict. One of the earliest moments of the war was marked by a series of confrontations. After Edward III declared himself the rightful king of France in 1337, the French began to rally behind their own king, Philip VI. By 1339, the English were able to push further into French territory, with Edward launching several successful raids. One of the most notable early battles of the war was the Battle of Sluys in 1350, where the English navy decisively defeated the French, securing their dominance of the English Channel for much of the war. This victory gave England a strong foothold, especially since control of the Channel was essential for trading and moving armies. As the war continued, it became clear that it wasn't just about one conflict, but a long, drawn-out series of battles, sieges, and shifting strategies. The war also saw the rise of important figures who would shape the history of the conflict, such as Joan of Arc, who would later inspire the French resistance and help turn the tide against the English. But for now, in these early years, both sides were heavily engaged in battles for land, control, and influence. It seemed that neither side would easily gain a clear advantage. The 100 Years' War had truly begun, and with it a new chapter in European history was unfolding. But this was just the beginning, and much more lay ahead. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the struggles, alliances, and turning points of this centuries-long conflict. The 100 Years' War took a dramatic turn as the conflict progressed, and in the middle of all this fighting, Europe faced one of the most devastating natural disasters in history, the Black Death. Beginning in the year 1347, the Black Death spread rapidly across the continent, hitting both England and France hard. The plague, carried by fleas on rats, devastated populations, killing millions. It's believed that between 1/3 and half of Europe's population was wiped out by the disease. The war itself had already been grueling, but now, with entire villages and towns decimated by this deadly outbreak, both the English and the French found themselves dealing with something far more dangerous than the enemy armies on the battlefield. As the plague spread, it didn't just impact the soldiers who fought in the war, but the general population as well. Towns and cities were left without workers, and the economic structures of both kingdoms began to crumble. In many places, entire villages were left empty, their buildings abandoned as people fled or died. The social structure of Europe was completely disrupted. Farmers, artisans, and laborers were gone, and those left behind were in constant fear of falling ill themselves. This created chaos as resources became scarce, and the demand for goods outstripped the supply. The Black Death also had a significant effect on the war itself. Both England and France had been deeply involved in a cycle of battles, sieges, and territorial disputes, but the plague caused delays and changes in strategies. With soldiers falling ill and dying in large numbers, armies found it harder to keep up the fight. In some areas, military campaigns were paused, and the war was effectively put on hold for a time. Yet even during these pauses, the political tensions between the two nations didn't ease. The French were struggling with their own leadership problems as King Charles VI, who reigned from 1380 to 1422, was severely affected by periods of mental illness. This left the French throne vulnerable, leading to internal conflict and allowing the English to gain some advantages during this difficult period. But despite the plague and the mental instability of French leadership, the war continued to rage on. In the year 1359, the English gained control of Paris after the French king was forced to sign a peace treaty, but the peace was short-lived. The English faced constant rebellions, uprisings, and battles that stretched their resources and manpower. Still, they continued to push forward, driven by the belief that they had a legitimate claim to the French throne. Meanwhile, the French were not easily defeated. Despite internal struggles, the people of France began to rally behind a young peasant girl, Joan of Arc. Born around 1400, Joan's rise to fame was both inspirational and extraordinary. At just 16 years old, she claimed to have received visions from saints telling her to help France reclaim its throne. Her leadership and unwavering faith in her mission made her a symbol of resistance. In 1430, after leading the French army to a crucial victory at Orléans, Joan became the face of French nationalism, and her involvement in the war boosted the morale of her countrymen. Sadly, Joan's journey was short-lived. She was captured by the English in 1431 and later executed. However, her legacy lived on, and she became a martyr who symbolized the determination and resilience of the French people. By the time the war reached its final stages, both sides were exhausted, and the political and social upheaval of the time had taken its toll. The Black Death had already altered the course of European society, and now the war was entering its final phase. By the year 1453, the English had lost nearly all their territories in France. marking the end of the conflict. France had emerged victorious, but the lasting effects of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death would be felt for generations. The war, combined with the devastation of the plague, had forever changed the landscape of Europe. Both England and France had suffered enormous losses in terms of human life, land, and resources. The political structures of both nations had been shaken to their core. Yet despite everything, the war showed how nations and people can endure through the hardest of times. As the war between England and France raged on, it became clear that the 100 Years' War was not just about territorial disputes. It was a battle for national identity. Over time, the conflict began to evolve, and the role of the monarchy in shaping the fate of both nations became more evident. In England, King Edward III's early successes in the war had earned him widespread support, and the English had gained significant territory in France. However, the war's long duration meant that the people of both countries began to grow weary of the ongoing violence and loss. Edward III's death in 1377 marked a turning point for England. His grandson, Richard II, became king at a very young age, and this change in leadership brought instability to England. Richard II's reign was marked by rising internal tensions, especially the infamous Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The revolt was fueled by the harsh economic conditions caused by the war, as well as the lingering effects of the Black Death. Many workers had died, and the remaining peasants were forced to work longer hours for lower wages. This discontent led to violent uprisings, which were brutally suppressed by the English crown. Meanwhile, France was also struggling to find stability. Charles VI, who had become king in 1380, faced constant challenges to his rule. His mental illness, which would last for much of his reign, left France vulnerable to both internal divisions and external threats. While France's nobility fought amongst themselves for power, the English capitalized on the chaos, expanding their control over vast swaths of French territory. By the year 1400, England had gained control of almost half of France, including the crucial northern regions. However, the fortunes of war began to shift in the early 15th century. The French, despite their internal struggles, began to reorganize their forces and leadership. The rise of Joan of Arc was a significant turning point. Her divine visions and leadership inspired the French army to reclaim important cities like Orléans. Joan's victories were not just military successes, they were also symbolic. She became a symbol of hope for the French people and a rallying figure that united the country's divided factions. Her courage and dedication turned the tide of the war in France's favor, even though her eventual capture and execution by the English in 1431 was a tragic loss for the French cause. Joan's death, however, did not extinguish the French spirit. By the year 1439, the French King Charles VII had managed to solidify his hold over much of the country, and the English were starting to retreat. A critical shift occurred during the Battle of Famine in 1445, where the French achieved a decisive victory. This battle marked the beginning of the end for English hopes of maintaining control over France. The French, aided by the revitalized leadership and a growing sense of national unity, began to push the English out of their territory. Meanwhile, the English crown was grappling with its own challenges. After years of costly military campaigns and the devastating effects of the Black Death, England's economy was in shambles. The toll of the war was heavy on both the military and the civilians. The English soldiers were stretched thin, and their morale was low. The French, buoyed by their recent successes and a renewed sense of purpose, continued to drive the English forces back. By the year 1453, the final stages of the war were underway. The English had lost the crucial Battle of Castillon, and the French were rapidly reclaiming their land. This marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War. The Treaty of Picquigny, signed in 1460, formally ended hostilities between the two nations, though England would not fully relinquish its claim to French territory until much later. The 100 Years' War had left an indelible mark on both England and France. It reshaped the political and social landscapes of both countries and solidified the concept of nationalism. The war also had long-lasting effects on the military tactics of the time, with the introduction of new technologies such as the longbow, which proved to be a key weapon in the conflict. The war was also a catalyst for changes in warfare and leadership, setting the stage for future conflicts in Europe. Despite the immense loss of life, resources, and land, the 100 Years' War ultimately resulted in the emergence of stronger, more centralized monarchies in both countries. France, once divided and vulnerable, emerged victorious and unified under Charles VII. England, though defeated, began to turn inward, eventually focusing its efforts on rebuilding and dealing with internal conflicts, particularly the War of the Roses, which would erupt shortly after the 100 Years' War concluded. The war had reshaped the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects, forever changing the course of European history. It also reinforced the idea that wars were not just fought for land or power, but for the very identity of a nation. As France and England rebuilt after the war, the memory of the 100 Years' War would remain a significant part of their shared history. As the 100 Years' War came to an end, the impact of this prolonged conflict could still be felt across Europe. Both England and France, though exhausted and deeply scarred by the violence and destruction, found themselves on the precipice of change. The years of bloodshed, battles, and political instability had left their mark, but they also opened the door to significant social, economic, and cultural transformations. One of the most lasting effects of the war was the shift in the power dynamics between the monarchy and the people. The war had proven that the strength of a nation relied not just on the crown, but also on the unity of its people. In France, this newfound sense of unity was particularly evident. The war had forced the French to come together, despite internal divisions and the chaos that had plagued the country. This sense of nationalism, which had been a major driving force behind the French resistance during the conflict, would continue to grow and shape the future of France in the centuries to come. For England, the aftermath of the war was marked by internal strife. The defeat in France left the English crown weakened and struggling to maintain control. The loss of French territories and the heavy financial burden of the war led to growing dissatisfaction among the English nobility and common people alike. This unrest would soon lead to one of the most turbulent periods in English history, the War of the Roses. The War of the Roses, which began in 1455, was a civil conflict between the two main branches of the English royal family, the houses of Lancaster and York. The war was rooted in the instability that followed the loss of France, and the increasing inability of the monarchy to manage the country's affairs. The political tension that had built up during the 100 Years' War came to a head, leading to a series of battles that would ultimately result in the rise of the Tudor dynasty. While England was embroiled in its own civil war, France, under the leadership of Charles VII, was beginning the difficult task of rebuilding. The devastation caused by the war, coupled with the aftermath of the Black Death, had left much of the country in ruins. But Charles VII, taking lessons from the war, worked to strengthen the monarchy and centralize power, solidifying his rule over a now unified France. The French people, weary from the years of fighting, found themselves looking to the monarchy for stability and guidance. In addition to political shifts, the war had lasting economic consequences for both nations. The cost of the war had drained both England and France's resources. In England, the loss of French territories meant the loss of valuable income from land and trade. For France, the war had devastated the economy, especially in the regions that had seen the heaviest fighting. The destruction of farmland, towns, and infrastructure had left a country struggling to recover. The aftermath of the war also saw significant changes in the military landscape. The 100 Years' War had been a turning point in the development of military technology and tactics. The use of the longbow, which had proven so effective in battles like Agincourt, became a symbol of English military success. France, on the other hand, began to adapt its military tactics as well, learning from its defeats and integrating more advanced artillery into its forces. The war had shown that battles were not just won by knights and cavalry, but by new strategies and technologies that would define warfare in the coming centuries. The war also influenced the culture of both nations. The trauma of the war, along with the rise of new monarchies, led to a flourishing of the arts in France. The late medieval period saw the growth of Gothic architecture, as well as the development of new forms of literature and music. In England, the end of the war and the rise of the Tudors brought with it a renewed focus on national pride and identity, which would later influence the works of playwrights like William Shakespeare. In the broader context of Europe, the 100 Years' War had profound effects on the relationships between nations. The war had highlighted the importance of diplomacy, alliances, and the shifting nature of power on the continent. The balance of power in Europe was forever altered, and the war's legacy would continue to shape the political landscape for generations to come. Though the 100 Years' War had ended, its effects would resonate for centuries. The war had reshaped the idea of what it meant to be a nation, and the lessons learned during those long years of conflict would influence how future wars were fought and how nations interacted with each other. As England and France moved forward, they would both carry the scars of the war, but they would also carry the memories of the victories and losses that had defined their identities. As the 100 Years' War came to a close, both England and France faced the task of rebuilding in the aftermath of such an extensive and destructive conflict. The war had left its mark on the people, the land, and the political landscape, with deep scars that would take decades, if not centuries, to heal. Yet even as the final battles were fought and the peace was established, the legacies of the war continued to shape the future. One of the most significant changes after the war was the shift in power structures within both countries. For England, the loss of its French territories and the toll of the war on its resources marked the beginning of a new era of internal instability. The social and political unrest created by the heavy burden of war costs and the loss of international influence sparked a deep divide within the nobility. This unrest was a key factor that led to the War of the Roses, which began in 1455 and would continue for decades. The war between the houses of Lancaster and York was a direct result of the weakened English monarchy, which struggled to maintain control in the wake of the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, France emerged from the war with a more centralized monarchy. King Charles VII, who had been crowned under the shadow of war, worked hard to consolidate his power, using the lessons of the war to strengthen the French state. By the time the war ended, the monarchy had gained greater authority and control over the feudal system. In the process, France's social structure began to shift, with increased power flowing from local nobles to the central government. The French victory also fostered a renewed sense of nationalism and unity as the people rallied behind the idea of a strong, unified France. This newfound national identity would be an important catalyst for future developments, including the French Revolution centuries later. The war had also driven significant changes in military tactics and technology. The 100 Years' War marked a major turning point in the evolution of European warfare. The use of the longbow by English archers was a notable innovation, and its effectiveness on the battlefield forever altered the role of knights and cavalry in battle. Additionally, the war saw the increasing use of gunpowder weapons, particularly cannons, which would later become a defining feature of European conflicts. As both nations looked toward the future, military technology would continue to evolve, paving the way for new strategies in warfare. Economically, the war had devastated both countries. France, in particular, had suffered from widespread destruction, especially in the regions that had seen the worst of the fighting. The war had torn apart towns, villages, and farmlands, leaving much of the countryside in ruins. The French economy, already weakened by the Black Death and previous conflicts, now had to contend with the costs of rebuilding. For England, the loss of its territories in France meant the loss of valuable trade routes and income, further exacerbating the financial strain. Both countries would take years to recover from the economic damage wrought by the war, with France eventually using the opportunity to rebuild its infrastructure and re-establish trade routes. Despite the devastation, the 100 Years' War also sparked important cultural developments. In France, the war and the recovery that followed gave rise to a flourishing of Gothic art and architecture, as well as the rise of new forms of literature and philosophy. In England, the end of the war marked the beginning of a new chapter for the country. The emergence of the Tudor dynasty with the rise of Henry VII brought a renewed sense of stability. This period saw a rise in English nationalism, which would later influence the works of famous playwrights such as William Shakespeare. The consequences of the 100 Years' War also stretched far beyond England and France. The conflict had altered the balance of power in Europe, and the shift in political dynamics affected neighboring regions. The weakening of feudalism and the rise of more centralized monarchies set the stage for future conflicts and changes in governance across Europe. The war's impact on the social and economic fabric of Europe would continue to be felt for generations, shaping the course of European history in the centuries that followed. In the end, the 100 Years' War was a conflict that transformed both nations, Europe and the world. It was a war marked by brutal battles, shifting alliances, and profound changes in military, political, and social structures. Its legacy lasted far beyond the peace treaties of 1453, influencing the future of warfare, governance, and culture in ways that could not have been imagined at the time. The war taught the world hard lessons about the cost of prolonged conflict and the importance of diplomacy in maintaining peace. And though the war itself is long over, the echoes of its impact can still be heard today, shaping the course of history and reminding us of the lasting consequences of power struggles territorial disputes, and human endurance. The Great Chinese Famine was one of the deadliest disasters in human history, a crisis that unfolded over several years and left millions of people starving. While the famine itself lasted from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, the roots of this disaster ran deeper than just a few years of bad harvests. To fully understand what happened, we need to look at the events leading up to it, the decisions that shaped it, and the devastating impact it had on the people of China. The famine was not just a natural disaster, it was largely man-made. It all began with the Great Leap Forward, a massive campaign launched by Chairman Mao Zedong in the year 1958. The goal was to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. The idea was simple. By collectivizing farms and focusing on large-scale production, China would supposedly be able to produce more food while also increasing steel and industrial output. On paper, this sounded like a bold and ambitious plan, but in reality, it quickly turned into a disaster. One of the most significant changes was the formation of people's communes. These were massive collective farms where private land ownership was abolished, and farmers were forced to work together under government control. The problem was that these communes were not managed efficiently. Farmers were often assigned tasks they had a little experience with, and traditional farming methods were replaced with experimental techniques that did more harm than good. For example, the government promoted a technique called deep plowing, where farmers were instructed to plow deeper into the soil than ever before, believing it would help crops grow better. Instead, it damaged the soil and made it harder for plants to take root. Another issue was close planting, where crops were planted extremely close together under the assumption that it would lead to higher yields. In reality, this caused the plants to compete for nutrients and sunlight, leading to weaker and less productive crops. At the same time, the government insisted on using excessive amounts of fertilizers, many of which were not suitable for the land, further damaging the soil. These policies, combined with unrealistic production targets, led to widespread crop failures. As the situation worsened, local officials felt immense pressure to report success, regardless of reality. Many inflated their production numbers, falsely claiming that record amounts of grain were being harvested. This deception had tragic consequences. Since the central government believed there was a surplus of food, they continued to demand grain from the countryside to supply cities and even export food to other countries. Meanwhile, the rural population who actually grew the food was left with nothing. To make matters worse, nature dealt its own blows. The year 1959 saw severe droughts across major agricultural regions, further reducing crop yields. Then came flooding, which wiped out even more farmland. The combination of misguided policies and natural disasters created the perfect storm for what was about to come. By the end of 1959, food shortages were becoming a reality for millions of people. Farmers who once had control over their own harvests were now entirely dependent on government distribution, and as food supplies dwindled, starvation began to spread. People started to realize that something was terribly wrong, but the government refused to acknowledge the crisis. Propaganda continued to paint an image of success, and any voices of concern were quickly silenced. The stage was set for one of the deadliest famines in history, but at this point, the full extent of the disaster had not yet unfolded. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into how the famine escalated, the desperate measures people took to survive, and the government's response, or lack thereof, as millions began to starve. As the famine worsened in the year 1960, entire communities began to feel the devastating effects of starvation. Food supplies were rapidly diminishing, and for many rural families, the situation became a matter of life and death. Villages that once thrived on agriculture now struggled to find anything edible, and the once hopeful promises of the Great Leap Forward were now seen as empty words. One of the most tragic aspects of the crisis was how the government continued to deny the severity of the situation. Local officials, under immense pressure to show success, kept reporting inflated harvest numbers to higher authorities. These false reports created a deadly cycle. Since the central government believed the countryside had an abundance of food, they continued to take large portions of the harvest for cities, state reserves, and exports. The result was devastating. Rural villages, where the majority of China's population lived, were left with little to nothing to eat. At the same time, strict government policies made it nearly impossible for people to seek food elsewhere. Travel restrictions prevented villagers from leaving their communes to find food in other areas. Those who attempted to leave without permission were often arrested or even executed for defying government orders. The government's grip on information was just as tight. Any discussion of food shortages was seen as a challenge to authority, and those who spoke out were silenced. This created a terrifying situation where people were starving, but the official narrative claimed that everything was improving. Desperation forced people to take extreme measures to survive. Wild plants, tree bark, and even soil became sources of food for those with nothing left. In some cases, villagers dug up old grain husks from the ground, hoping to find any remaining nutrition. Reports from survivors tell of people boiling leather shoes, eating straw, or grinding tree leaves into paste in an effort to stay alive. But these desperate acts were often not enough. Malnutrition spread rapidly, leading to disease, weakness, and death. Adding to the suffering, famine-related diseases began to take hold. When people are severely malnourished, their immune systems weaken, making them more vulnerable to illness. Dysentery, typhoid, and other deadly diseases spread quickly in the weakened population. The lack of proper sanitation and medical care only worsened the crisis. Villages that had once been full of life became eerily quiet, as more and more people succumbed to hunger and disease. Despite the clear signs of a nationwide catastrophe, the government refused to admit the truth. Instead of providing aid, officials doubled down on propaganda, insisting that the famine was either exaggerated or the result of local mismanagement. Some even blamed farmers themselves, accusing them of hoarding food or failing to work hard enough. This denial meant that no real help was given, and millions continued to suffer in silence. By the end of 1960, the death toll had climbed into the tens of millions, but even as entire communities were being wiped out, the worst was still yet to come. In the next part, we'll explore the peak of the famine, the unimaginable lengths people went to in their fight for survival, and how the government's response, or lack of it, sealed the fate of millions. By the year 1961, the Great Chinese Famine had reached its most devastating point. Entire villages had been wiped out, leaving behind abandoned homes, empty fields, and mass graves. The countryside, once filled with hardworking farmers, was now a silent landscape of starvation and suffering. As food supplies ran out completely, people were forced to make impossible choices. In some areas, families resorted to eating clay, sawdust, and even poisonous roots in a desperate attempt to fill their stomachs. Many tried to catch rats, insects, or stray animals, anything that could provide even a small amount of nourishment. But as the famine continued, these sources disappeared as well, leaving people with nothing. Meanwhile, the government's strict control over movement and information only worsened the situation. Farmers were still forbidden from leaving their communes to search for food elsewhere, and the few who attempted to flee were often caught and punished. Many died on the side of roads, their bodies left where they fell, as others were too weak to bury them. The sight of skeletal figures wandering the countryside became tragically common. One of the darkest aspects of the famine was how those in power continued to prioritize politics over human life. Despite millions of deaths, grain exports to other countries continued, and government officials held lavish banquets while their people starved. Farmers, who had once produced food for the entire nation, were now dying in their own fields, surrounded by crops they were not allowed to eat. In urban areas, the effects of the famine were also severe, but city dwellers had slightly more access to government-controlled food supplies. However, rations were barely enough to survive, and only those with political connections or wealth could find additional food on the black market. Even in major cities, reports surfaced of people collapsing from hunger on the streets. As the famine reached its peak, the psychological toll became just as severe as the physical suffering. Families were torn apart as parents struggled to feed their children, and communities that had once relied on cooperation now faced brutal competition for survival. The weight of starvation drove people to desperation, and some were forced to abandon loved ones who could no longer move. Despite the overwhelming evidence of mass starvation, the government refused to acknowledge the full scale of the disaster. Censorship remained strict, and speaking out against the policies that had led to the famine was still considered a crime. Many who dared to criticize the government's handling of the crisis were arrested, silenced, or worse. The truth about what was happening remained hidden from the world and even from many within China itself. But as millions continued to die, cracks began to form in the official narrative. Some local officials, unable to ignore the suffering any longer, started quietly reporting the real conditions in their regions. Behind closed doors, discussions about the famine's true causes and possible solutions began to take place. The leadership was finally being forced to confront the consequences of its policies. In the final part, we'll explore how the famine eventually came to an end, the lasting impact it had on China, and the changes that followed in the years ahead. By the spring of 1962, the Great Chinese Famine had reached its grim climax. The once bustling countryside, home to millions of farmers and their families, had become a land of desolation. Entire villages had been wiped out, and the surviving population was emaciated and broken. The government, which had remained in denial for so long, could no longer ignore the devastating reality. Though the famine was not officially acknowledged until much later, the truth was undeniable. Millions had perished due to a combination of misguided policies, government negligence, and a refusal to adapt to the dire situation. As the famine began to ease, the government finally took some steps to address the crisis. In the wake of mass starvation, the agricultural policies that had caused the disaster were slowly abandoned. The people's communes, which had been central to the Great Leap Forward, were dismantled, and private farming once again became more common. The leadership, recognizing the scale of their failure, began to reverse the collectivization policies that had contributed so heavily to the crisis. But the damage was done. The human toll of the famine was staggering. Estimates of the death toll range widely, but most historians agree that at least 15 million people, and possibly many more, died as a result of the famine. Communities that had once been close-knit and vibrant were shattered, and the psychological scars left by years of suffering would linger for generations. The famine also left a deep and lasting impact on China's political landscape. The disastrous results of the Great Leap Forward severely damaged the credibility of Chairman Mao Zedong and his government. While Mao remained in power for years after the famine ended, the crisis marked the beginning of a slow but steady decline in his authority. His leadership, once seen as infallible, was now questioned by many, though public dissent was still heavily suppressed. Internationally, the famine remained largely hidden from the outside world during its peak. The government's tight control over information meant that the full extent of the crisis was not widely known until years later. In China, the government's official narrative continued to portray the famine as a minor issue, with some even blaming local mismanagement or other scapegoats for the tragedy. It wasn't until the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the opening of China's borders, that more open discussions of the famine began to emerge. Even then, it remained a sensitive and controversial topic, and those who sought to confront the government's role in the disaster often faced harsh consequences. As China moved into the post-famine years, recovery was slow. The scars of the famine ran deep, and many survivors struggled with physical and emotional trauma. The agricultural landscape, once ravaged by years of mismanagement, needed years of work to restore. For the people who lived through the famine, the memories of hunger, loss, and fear remained vivid. While the Great Chinese Famine came to an end, its legacy would continue to shape China's policies and its people for years to come. The disaster had exposed the dangers of central planning and political dogma when combined with the refusal to acknowledge reality. For the survivors, the famine was a reminder of the fragile nature of life in a country where political ideologies often came before human needs. In the years that followed, China would experience rapid economic growth and modernization, but the lessons of the famine remained a somber chapter in its history. The Great Leap Forward had promised progress, but instead brought ruin, and the famine that followed remains one of the darkest periods in modern history. Though time has passed, the memory of the Great Chinese Famine endures as a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked government control and the devastating consequences of ignoring human suffering in the pursuit of political goals. The Black Death was one of the deadliest disasters in human history, a plague so devastating that it wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in just a few short years. It arrived in the mid-14th century, spreading at an unstoppable pace and leaving behind a world forever changed. But how did it begin? And why was it so lethal? The origins of the Black Death trace back to the vast trade networks that connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Historians believe the outbreak began in the early 1340s in the dry plains of Central Asia, possibly in Mongolia. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, traveled along the Silk Road, infecting people and animals as it moved westward. It likely reached Europe through trade ships carrying infected rats and fleas, which thrived in the filthy, crowded conditions of medieval ports. By the year 1347, the plague had made its way to the bustling trade city of Kaffa, a Genoese-controlled settlement on the Crimean Peninsula. During a siege by Mongol forces, infected corpses were reportedly catapulted over the city walls, exposing the defenders to the deadly disease. Desperate to escape, Genoese merchants fled by ship, unknowingly carrying the plague to the ports of the Mediterranean. This marked the beginning of Europe's nightmare. The first confirmed cases in Europe appeared in Sicily in the autumn of 1347. Ships arriving in the port of Messina were filled with dying sailors, covered in black boils that oozed pus and blood. Within days, the disease spread through the city like wildfire. Those who tried to flee only carried the plague further inland. From Sicily, it spread rapidly to mainland Italy, reaching Florence, Genoa, and Venice within months. By the following year, it had torn through France and Spain, creeping ever closer to the rest of Europe. Medieval medicine was completely unprepared for a disease of this magnitude. No one understood how the plague spread, and fear led to wild speculation. Some believed it was a punishment from God, sent to cleanse the world of sin. Others blamed bad air, astrological events, or even poisoned wells. With no effective treatments, doctors relied on desperate and often gruesome remedies. Some advised bloodletting, while others recommended carrying flowers to ward off the evil air. But no matter what people tried, nothing stopped the Black Death. By the end of 1348, the plague had turned thriving cities into ghost towns. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, and mass graves became the only solution. Fear and panic took hold, and society began to crumble under the weight of so much death. And yet, this was only the beginning. The true scale of the devastation had yet to unfold, and Europe was about to descend into chaos. As the Black Death continued its relentless march across Europe, no region was spared. By the year 1349, the plague had spread deep into France, Germany, and England, devastating communities at an alarming rate. The disease moved so quickly that entire villages were wiped out before word of its approach could even reach them. It seemed as if death was always one step ahead. The symptoms of the Black Death were terrifying. Infected individuals first experienced flu-like signs, fever, chills, and exhaustion. But within a day or two, painful swellings known as buboes formed in the armpits, groin, or neck. These swollen lumps, filled with pus and blood, turned black as the infection worsened, giving the disease its infamous name. Some victims suffered from internal bleeding, coughing up blood as their bodies shut down. Once symptoms appeared, death often followed within days. The sheer speed of the disease overwhelmed cities. In London, Paris, and other major hubs, people fell sick so quickly that hospitals could not keep up. The streets became filled with the dying and the dead, and carts were pulled through towns to collect bodies for mass burials. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the sounds of grieving families echoed through empty streets. The living were forced to move on, leaving their dead behind. With entire households wiped out, social order began to collapse. Government officials, priests, and city leaders either died or fled, leaving towns without structure. Lawlessness took hold in many places. In some regions, those who were sick were boarded up in their homes and left to die in isolation. In others, entire villages were abandoned, the survivors choosing to take their chances elsewhere rather than stay in infected areas. Fear led to desperation, and desperation led to blame. Without scientific understanding, people searched for an explanation. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins, leading to an increase in religious fervor. Groups of flagellants roamed the countryside, whipping themselves in public as an act of penance, hoping their suffering would bring an end to the disease. Others turned their fear towards specific groups, fueling violence. Jewish communities, already facing widespread discrimination, were accused of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the plague. Across Europe, brutal attacks were carried out, with entire Jewish populations being massacred or forced to flee. These false accusations only added to the chaos, deepening the suffering in an already broken world. Yet despite the devastation, the plague showed no sign of stopping. By late 1349, it had reached Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, continuing its deadly journey. The question on everyone's mind was the same: would this ever end? By the year 1350, the Black Death had firmly embedded itself across Europe, leaving an unimaginable trail of death and despair. No region had been spared, and the disease showed no signs of slowing down. The impact was more than just the staggering loss of life. It was reshaping the very foundations of society. One of the most immediate effects was the collapse of the workforce. With so many people dying in such a short time, labor shortages crippled entire industries. Farms were left abandoned. Crops rotted in the fields, and food production plummeted. This led to widespread famine as fewer people were left to harvest grain, raise livestock, or transport goods to market. In cities, essential trades and services disappeared overnight. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and merchants were all dying at the same rate as the peasants, leaving no one to maintain basic infrastructure. With labor in such high demand, those who survived found themselves in a new position of power. Wages skyrocketed as landowners and business owners scrambled to hire workers. Peasants, who had once been bound to the land under the strict feudal system, now had leverage for the first time. Many left their lords in search of better pay, triggering a slow but irreversible shift in social structure. The rigid class hierarchy that had defined medieval Europe for centuries was beginning to break apart. At the same time, the fear of the disease had permanently changed how people interacted. Families turned against each other, with parents abandoning sick children and husbands leaving dying wives in an effort to save themselves. Neighbors avoided one another, and once thriving communities became ghost towns. The very concept of trust had been shattered, as no one knew who might be carrying the invisible killer. Medicine was nearly useless in the face of such a powerful disease, but that did not stop doctors from trying. With no understanding of bacteria or viruses, physicians relied on whatever theories they could come up with. Some believed the disease was caused by bad air, leading to the widespread use of fragrant herbs and flowers to ward off infection. Others promoted bizarre treatments like burning aromatic wood, bathing in vinegar, or covering the body with crushed emeralds. None of these methods worked, but people were willing to try anything to escape the horror unfolding around them. Quarantine efforts also became more extreme. In some cities, infected houses were sealed off, leaving those inside to die without medical care or even access to food and water. Ships arriving in ports were forced to wait offshore for weeks before passengers were allowed to disembark. The city of Venice implemented one of the earliest known quarantine policies, requiring ships to remain isolated for a full 40 days before docking, a practice that would later influence modern public health measures. But despite these efforts, the plague continued its relentless spread. By 1351, it had reached the farthest corners of Europe, tearing through what little remained of civilization's stability. The world that had existed before the Black Death was gone, and the survivors were left to navigate an uncertain and unrecognizable future. By the year 1351, the Black Death had reached nearly every part of Europe, and its devastation was beyond anything the world had ever seen. But even as the worst of the outbreak began to fade, its effects were far from over. The survivors faced a world that had been reshaped by death, fear, and desperation. One of the most noticeable changes was the transformation of cities and towns. Many once bustling centers of trade had become abandoned, with entire neighborhoods left empty. The sheer number of deaths had outpaced burial efforts, and in some areas, mass graves stretched across the landscape. Fields that had once been filled with crops now lay untouched, overgrown with weeds, as there were simply not enough people left to tend them. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. The plague had struck without warning, wiping out families, communities, and entire ways of life. Those who lived through it carried deep emotional scars, having witnessed unimaginable suffering. Many people were left without parents, spouses, or children. The concept of family itself had changed, as people who had no remaining relatives were forced to rebuild their lives among strangers. Religious beliefs were also shaken to their core. For centuries, the Catholic Church had been the most powerful institution in Europe, guiding people's faith and daily lives. But the plague had spread so widely and killed so indiscriminately that many began to question why God had allowed such suffering. Some turned to extreme religious devotion, believing the plague was divine punishment that could only be eased through acts of penance. Others lost faith entirely, seeing the church's inability to stop the disease as proof that it was powerless. This shift in religious thinking would eventually contribute to major changes in Europe, including movements that challenged the church's authority. The social order had also been permanently altered. Before the plague, European society had been built on a rigid feudal system where peasants worked the land for lords in exchange for protection. But with the population drastically reduced, labor became more valuable than ever before. Those who survived realized they had options. If one lord refused to pay fair wages, they could leave and work for another. This newfound mobility weakened the traditional system of lords and peasants, setting the stage for the eventual decline of feudalism. Economically, the effects of the Black Death were felt for years. While the initial aftermath saw shortages and inflation due to the sudden loss of workers The long-term impact was more complex. With fewer people, land and goods became more available, allowing some survivors to gain wealth and status that would have been impossible before. Cities that had once been overcrowded saw a rise in living standards as resources were no longer stretched as thin. The plague had even changed how people thought about health and disease. Although medieval medicine had little understanding of germs or how illnesses spread, the need for quarantine, sanitation, and hygiene became more widely accepted. Some cities began implementing public health measures that would later influence the development of modern medicine. By the end of 1351, the worst of the Black Death had passed, but the world that emerged from its shadow was vastly different from the one that had existed before. The survivors were left to pick up the pieces, adjusting to a reality where nothing, not their communities, their beliefs, or their way of life, would ever be the same. By the time the Black Death finally subsided in 1353, the world had been permanently changed. The plague had reshaped Europe's population, economy, and society in ways that would be felt for centuries. But while the worst was over, its effects did not simply vanish. The scars it left behind continued to shape history long after the last wave of the disease faded. One of the most immediate and lasting consequences was the shift in power between the ruling elite and the working class. Before the Black Death, the feudal system had kept peasants tied to the land, working for lords in exchange for basic protections. But after so many laborers had died, those who remained realized they had leverage. Lords could no longer dictate low wages because workers were scarce, and many peasants began demanding better pay and conditions. Some even left their villages in search of higher wages elsewhere, something that would have been unthinkable before. This gradual breakdown of the feudal system paved the way for the rise of a new middle class and the eventual movement toward a more modern economy. Another major change was in how people viewed life itself. After witnessing so much death and destruction, many survivors adopted a new outlook, one that valued living in the moment. This shift in thinking played a role in the cultural and artistic transformations that followed. In the decades after the Black Death, Europe saw a renewed interest in science, learning, and creativity, an early sign of what would later become the Renaissance. Some historians even believe that the plague helped accelerate this period of intellectual and artistic growth, as people sought to rebuild their world in a way that was richer and more meaningful than before. Medicine, too, was forever altered. While doctors in the 14th century had little understanding of germs, the sheer scale of the Black Death forced medical practitioners to experiment with new treatments and public health measures. The idea of quarantines, for example, became more widely accepted after cities like Venice successfully slowed the spread of the disease by isolating arriving ships. Over time, these early attempts at disease control influenced future medical advancements, eventually leading to better sanitation practices and a deeper understanding of how illnesses spread. But even as Europe slowly recovered, the Black Death never fully disappeared. Outbreaks of plague continued to emerge over the next several centuries. Though none were as devastating as the initial wave, the disease resurfaced in cycles, reminding people of the horrors they had once endured. However, each outbreak also brought new efforts to contain and prevent its spread, further shaping the way societies responded to disease. Looking back, the Black Death was more than just a catastrophic natural disaster. It was a turning point in human history. It upended long-standing social structures, changed economic systems, and even influenced cultural and scientific advancements. The world that emerged after the plague was not the same as the one that had existed before, and in many ways, the lessons learned from that dark period helped shape the modern era. Even today, the Black Death remains one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. Its impact is still studied by historians, scientists, and medical experts trying to understand how societies respond to widespread disease. While modern medicine has come a long way since the 14th century, the echoes of the Black Death remind us that humanity has faced and survived devastating pandemics before. Thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What surprised you most about the Black Death? Let me know, and don't forget to tune in for my next video, where I'll be diving into more historical disasters and events. The Irish Potato Famine, also known as the Great Hunger, is one of the most tragic and defining events in Irish history. The famine took place from 1845 to 1852, and it left a permanent mark on the country and its people. It's an event that still gets talked about today, with many people looking back at the impact it had on Ireland's culture, economy, and population. But what exactly happened, and why was this famine so devastating? At its core, the famine was caused by the failure of the potato crop, which was a major food source for the Irish population. The potato had become the staple crop for many Irish peasants, especially in rural areas. It was a cheap and easy crop to grow, and it provided a reliable source of nutrition for families, particularly those living in poverty. However, in 1845, a disease called Phytophthora infestans, also known as potato blight, began to spread across Ireland, wiping out entire crops of potatoes. This blight made the potatoes rot, leaving them inedible, and causing an immediate food shortage. The situation quickly worsened, with the blight returning year after year, making it impossible to harvest enough potatoes to feed the population. By 1847, the crisis was in full swing, and famine was widespread. It wasn't just a bad crop failure here and there. The entire food system of Ireland was brought to its knees, but while the cause of the famine seems simple, a failed potato crop, the true reasons behind the tragedy go much deeper, and it's here where we begin to see the full scope of the disaster. The Irish population was already struggling under difficult conditions before the famine hit. Ireland, under British rule at the time, had long been a poor and exploited country. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, which meant they didn't own their land and were at the mercy of landlords who often raised rents. The land was divided into small plots, and these small farmers were forced to rely heavily on a single crop for their survival: the potato. This over-reliance on one crop made the population vulnerable to disaster when that crop failed. But the potato blight wasn't the only factor that made the famine so deadly. The British government's response, or rather lack of response, made the situation even worse. The British authorities at the time believed in a policy called laissez-faire, which essentially meant that they thought the market should take care of things without interference. The idea was that people should be left to fend for themselves, and that the government should not be directly involved in providing aid. This hands-off approach proved to be disastrous, especially in a crisis like the potato famine. The Irish people needed help, but the British government was slow to act. When they did intervene, it was often too little, too late, or poorly executed. British officials focused on sending food exports out of Ireland, believing that they would be more useful to the economy if shipped abroad rather than being used to help the starving population. This policy was met with growing outrage and despair as people continued to starve. As the famine stretched on, the death toll began to rise dramatically. It's estimated that over 1 million people died from hunger, disease, and malnutrition. Thousands more fled Ireland, seeking refuge in other countries, particularly the United States. The mass emigration created a diaspora of Irish people who would carry the memory of the famine with them for generations. The impact was so profound that it reshaped Ireland's demographic makeup, and many Irish families would never return to their homeland. In the midst of this devastation, the Irish people displayed incredible resilience. Despite the British government's failures, local communities banded together to provide what little support they could. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and groups organized protests in an attempt to bring attention to the famine's severity. While the government was slow to act, the Irish people's determination to survive and support one another was remarkable. So, what does this all mean? The Irish potato famine was not just a natural disaster caused by a crop failure. It was a tragedy born out of a combination of bad weather, political neglect, and social inequality. It was a moment in history that changed Ireland forever, and its legacy continues to shape the country today. But as we'll see in the next part, the famine was more than just a tragic event. It was also a turning point that would spark change and lead to a rethinking of how governments should respond to disaster and human suffering. Stay tuned as we explore more of the complexities of the Irish potato famine and how its lasting impact continues to echo through history. The Irish potato famine wasn't just a disaster caused by the failure of a single crop. The broader circumstances in Ireland made the famine much worse and helped fuel its devastating consequences. Before the blight ever arrived, Ireland was already struggling under a system of inequality and poverty that made it highly vulnerable to disaster. The impact of the famine was deeply tied to a mix of British colonial policies, the structure of Irish society, and economic pressures that had been building for years. By the time the famine hit, much of the Irish population had already been living in dire conditions. Many Irish people were tenant farmers, meaning they rented their land from landlords rather than owning it. This system left farmers at the mercy of rent demands, and when times were tough, they had little control over their ability to provide for their families. The Irish peasants were heavily reliant on the land for survival, but the small plots of land they worked on made them extremely vulnerable to crop failures. The widespread use of the potato as the main source of food meant that when the crop failed, so did the livelihoods of the people. Over-reliance on the potato wasn't just a cultural choice, it was the result of economic pressures that forced many Irish farmers to rely on a single crop for survival. During the early 1800s, the British government passed a series of laws that severely restricted the rights of Irish tenants. These laws made it harder for Irish farmers to hold on to their land and forced many to depend on a crop that could be grown quickly and on small plots, the potato. The potato was cheap to grow, nutritious, and could feed entire families, but its widespread use across Ireland made the country highly vulnerable to any problems with the crop. When the potato blight first hit in 1845, it was a major shock, but the true devastation didn't set in until later. The blight wiped out nearly half of Ireland's potato crop in that year alone, but it wasn't just the blight that caused mass starvation. The social and economic structures of Ireland made the problem far worse. Without enough food to feed the population, Irish peasants had few options. Many were already living on the edge with little access to proper nutrition or medical care. With so many people relying on potatoes for their daily diet, there were few alternative food sources when the crop failed. The British government, which ruled over Ireland at the time, didn't seem to fully grasp the scale of the crisis. British officials were primarily concerned with the economy and maintaining control over Ireland, not the well-being of the Irish people. As the famine worsened, the British government was slow to respond. They didn't want to interfere with what they saw as the natural workings of the market, even as millions were starving. This laissez-faire attitude, which means letting things take their course without interference, meant that very little relief was provided to the Irish people. Instead of sending aid, British policies focused on exporting food from Ireland, thinking that keeping the economy going would eventually solve the problem. But this decision only made things worse, as food was being taken from the country while millions of people went hungry. Meanwhile, the British government passed laws like the infamous Gregory Clause, which prohibited relief to anyone who owned more than a quarter of an acre of land. This clause was meant to encourage the poor to leave their farms and seek work elsewhere, but in practice, it left many with a choice between starvation or homelessness. In the face of all this hardship, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves. Despite the lack of government assistance, many communities took matters into their own hands. People organized soup kitchens, helped one another with what little food they had, and worked together to try to survive. There were also protests and demonstrations as the Irish people expressed their anger at the British government's inaction. While many suffered in silence, these acts of defiance showed that the Irish people were far from helpless. They had a fierce determination to survive, even in the worst of circumstances. As the famine stretched on, more and more people died, not just from starvation, but from diseases like typhus and dysentery, which spread quickly in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The death toll is hard to estimate precisely, but it's believed that at least 1 million people died during the famine. In addition to the deaths, millions of others were forced to leave Ireland in search of a better life. The Irish diaspora, particularly to the United States, grew dramatically during and after the famine, as people fled the dire conditions in Ireland. The mass emigration that followed had a lasting impact on Ireland. Entire communities were lost, and the population of Ireland dropped by about a quarter. This also meant that the famine's consequences were felt not just in Ireland, but in the countries where Irish immigrants settled, especially in America. The legacy of the famine shaped the identity of the Irish people for generations, influencing both the Irish who remained in Ireland and those who started new lives in foreign lands. So what was the impact of all this? The Irish potato famine was not just a food crisis, it was a turning point in Ireland's history. The failure of the British government to provide meaningful assistance during this crisis led to deep resentment and anger toward the British. Many Irish people began to see the famine as a direct result of British colonialism and policies that treated the Irish as second-class citizens. This anger would eventually lead to a push for independence and reform in the following decades. The potato famine, while a tragedy, also played a key role in shaping Ireland's path to the modern era. As we continue to explore the deeper complexities of the famine, we can start to see the long-lasting effects it had on both Ireland and its people. It wasn't just a period of loss, but one of profound change. Stay tuned on Dulkit with the next part of this story, where we will look at how the British government's policies and the Irish response to the famine set the stage for the future. As the famine deepened, the effects of British policies became even more apparent. The British government's response, or lack of it, was one of the most controversial aspects of the potato famine. While the Irish population struggled to survive, the British government continued to follow a policy of non-intervention, under the belief that market forces would eventually balance things out. But this idea, which worked in some situations, was disastrous when applied to the desperate conditions in Ireland. The British approach ignored the scale of the crisis, the unique situation in Ireland, and the human suffering that was taking place. The economic theory of laissez-faire, which believed in minimal government involvement, was ill-suited to handle such a catastrophic event. At the heart of this failure was a series of decisions that prioritized economic interest over human lives. One of the most glaring examples of this was the continued export of food from Ireland during the famine. Even though millions of people were starving, Ireland's ports were still exporting grain, meat, and other essential foodstuffs to Britain and other countries. This was driven by the British government's economic policies, which prioritized keeping trade flowing and maintaining the stability of the market. While Irish people were dying from hunger, their own resources were being shipped abroad. To make matters worse, when relief efforts were provided, they were either too little or too late and often poorly managed. The British government set up workhouses where the Irish could go for food and shelter, but these were overcrowded and poorly maintained, and many people were turned away. The workhouse conditions were so bad that many would rather risk starvation than enter them. Public works projects were also introduced, but these too failed to alleviate the suffering. While some infrastructure was built, the projects were insufficient to meet the needs of the population, and the workers were often paid poorly, which made it hard for them to support their families. British relief efforts were slow, ineffective, and often seen as an afterthought rather than a true attempt to save lives. The British government also imposed policies that were seen as punitive rather than helpful. One of the most infamous examples of this was the introduction of the Gregory Clause in 1847. This clause, named after Sir William Gregory, a British politician, stated that only those who owned less than a quarter of an acre of land were eligible for relief. The idea was to encourage people to leave their land and go to the cities to find work, but in practice, this policy devastated the Irish poor, forcing many of them to choose between starvation or giving up their homes. It was a clear example of how the British government's response was more concerned with maintaining social control than with alleviating the suffering of the Irish people. Meanwhile, the Irish people were left to fend for themselves, and they responded in ways that showed both their resilience and frustration. As the government failed to act, communities began to organize their own relief efforts. Soup kitchens were set up, donations were collected, and people worked together to support one another. In many areas, the Irish created their own forms of resistance, including protests and demonstrations, to demand better treatment from the British authorities. Though these actions were often small and localized, they demonstrated the defiance and strength of the Irish people. They refused to accept the status quo, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. But even with the best efforts of the Irish people, the famine continued to rage. Over the course of the famine, it's estimated that 1 million people died from hunger and disease. Another million were forced to emigrate, mainly to the United States, where Irish immigrants began to form a significant part of the population. The Irish diaspora, which had been growing steadily, swelled dramatically during and after the famine. Many of those who survived found themselves starting over in foreign lands, leaving behind the poverty and despair that had gripped their homeland. The emigration caused by the famine had lasting effects on both Ireland and the countries that received the Irish immigrants. In Ireland, the population dropped by nearly a quarter, and entire communities were lost. Those who stayed behind were left with the memory of the tragedy and the resentment toward the British government that would continue for decades. For the Irish immigrants, the famine was a defining moment. It shaped their identity and played a role in the rise of Irish nationalism, particularly in the United States. The Irish, who had once been seen as an underclass in their homeland, now began to rise in prominence in their new communities, fueled by the trauma of the famine and their desire for a better life. The Irish potato famine was not just a food crisis, it was also a political and social crisis. It exposed the deep inequalities that existed in Ireland and the callousness of British policies toward the Irish people. It showed how British colonialism, combined with the lack of effective government response, could lead to catastrophic consequences. And it revealed the strength and determination of the Irish people, who refused to accept their fate and found ways to survive, even in the face of overwhelming odds. By the time the famine began to subside in 1852, its effects were already felt far and wide. The social, political, and cultural landscape of Ireland had been forever altered. The famine had not only caused immense human suffering, but it also ignited a spark of resistance that would continue to burn in Ireland for years to come. As we look at the aftermath of the famine and its lasting impact on Irish society, we can begin to understand why this event is still so deeply felt today. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where we will examine the long-term effects of the famine on both Ireland and the world. As the years passed after the Irish potato famine, the long-term effects of the tragedy continued to shape both Ireland and the broader world. The loss of nearly a quarter of the Irish population, both in death and emigration, left Ireland in a state of deep social and economic upheaval. Entire communities had been wiped out, and those who remained were often traumatized by the horrific events they had witnessed. The famine's aftermath was not just about dealing with immediate starvation and poverty. It was about the profound psychological scars it left on the Irish people and their sense of identity. One of the most significant effects of the famine was the mass emigration of the Irish population, particularly to the United States. An estimated 1 million Irish men, women, and children left Ireland during and after the famine, seeking a better life across the Atlantic. This migration was not just a flight from hunger, it was a desperate attempt to escape the economic and political circumstances that had contributed to the famine in the first place. The Irish who left behind their homeland found themselves in a strange new world, where they faced their own set of challenges, but also the possibility of a fresh start. In the United States, Irish immigrants were often met with hostility and discrimination, as many Americans viewed them as a poor, uneducated, and undesirable group. However, over time, the Irish immigrants would prove themselves to be resilient and hardworking, slowly carving out a place for themselves in American society. They became an important part of the labor force, particularly in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where they worked in factories, on railroads, and in construction. The Irish also began to build their own communities, churches, and institutions, creating a strong cultural identity that was rooted in their experiences of hardship and survival. This massive wave of immigration would also have significant effects on the political landscape of the United States. The Irish immigrants, many of whom were poor and working class, found a voice in the country's burgeoning labor movement. They played an instrumental role in pushing for better working conditions, higher wages, and the right to form unions. The Irish also became increasingly involved in politics, with Irish Americans eventually rising to power in major cities and even in the US Congress. This political influence would continue to grow throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Irish Americans became a formidable political force in the United States. Back in Ireland, the effects of the famine were no less profound. The population had been decimated, and the country's rural economy was in shambles. The devastation caused by the failure of the potato crop, coupled with the economic policies of the British government, had left the Irish people with little means of recovery. The lack of investment in the country's infrastructure and the British government's continued neglect only exacerbated the situation. Despite the aid provided by Irish communities and emigrants abroad, recovery was slow. The land itself had been severely damaged by years of over-reliance on the potato, and many farmers were unable to rebuild their livelihoods. The famine also brought to the forefront the deep political and social divisions between the Irish people and the British government. The anger and resentment toward British policies that had fueled the famine never fully dissipated. In fact, the famine became a rallying point for Irish nationalism. Many Irish began to view the famine as a clear example of British neglect and oppression, and it strengthened calls for Irish independence. The memory of the famine would continue to fuel political movements in Ireland for decades, and it played a significant role in the push for home rule and eventually full independence. In the decades following the famine, the Irish people began to rebuild their communities and their country. Despite the devastating loss of life and the trauma left by the famine, the Irish displayed remarkable resilience. They sought to preserve their culture, language, and traditions, even as they faced tremendous odds. The Irish language, which had been in decline for years, experienced a revival as a symbol of national pride and resistance to British control. Cultural institutions, such as theaters, museums, and schools, were founded to promote Irish identity and history. In the global context, the Irish potato famine also had far-reaching effects. It is often seen as a catalyst for broader social and political movements. particularly in relation to food security and the rights of colonized peoples. The famine highlighted the dangers of monoculture farming, the over-reliance on a single crop, and the vulnerabilities of agricultural societies. It also exposed the risks of unchecked market policies and the devastating impact they can have on vulnerable populations. The global awareness of the Irish tragedy led to increased activism for food aid and social justice, as well as growing support for movements that sought to protect the rights of the impoverished and disenfranchised. Over time, the Irish potato famine became a symbol of survival and struggle. It was a defining moment in Irish history that continued to shape the country's political, social, and cultural landscape. The famine not only reshaped the lives of those who lived through it, but also left a legacy of activism and resistance that would echo throughout generations. As we reflect on the effects of the famine, we begin to see how such tragedies can spark change, giving rise to new ideas and movements that push for justice and equality. In the next part of this story, we will explore how the famine continues to impact Irish identity and global memory, and how its legacy is still felt today. As we reach the final part of this story, it's important to reflect on the long-lasting impact of the Irish potato famine and how it continues to shape Ireland and its people today. The Great Hunger, as it's often called, remains one of the darkest chapters in Irish history, and its repercussions can still be felt across the world. The famine was not just a devastating loss of life, it was a pivotal moment that changed the course of history in Ireland, influenced the global political landscape, and left an imprint on generations of Irish people, both in Ireland and abroad. One of the most profound ways the famine has shaped Irish identity is through the deep sense of loss and survival that remains at the core of the national consciousness. For many Irish people, the memory of the famine is not just about the tragedy of those years, but about the strength and resilience of those who endured it. Even as the famine devastated Ireland, it also created a new sense of unity among the Irish people, one that transcended geographical boundaries. The shared experience of suffering and loss became a bond that would last for generations, uniting the Irish diaspora around the world. This sense of solidarity can still be seen today, especially in the way the Irish community comes together to remember the victims of the famine. Every year, on the anniversary of the famine's peak, Irish people hold memorials and events to honor those who perished and to reflect on the ongoing struggles faced by marginalized communities. These events serve as a reminder of the resilience of the Irish people, and they continue to foster a deep sense of pride in the country's history, culture, and ability to overcome adversity. The legacy of the famine also extends to the political and social movements that it inspired, particularly in Ireland's fight for independence. The trauma of the famine played a significant role in the rise of Irish nationalism, as many began to view British colonial rule as the cause of their suffering. This sentiment fueled the demand for Irish self-rule and eventually led to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922. The Irish nationalist movement, which gained momentum after the famine, would go on to shape the political landscape of Ireland for much of the 20th century. In addition to its role in fostering Irish nationalism, the famine also had a lasting effect on the global awareness of food security, colonial exploitation, and the treatment of vulnerable populations. The Irish potato famine highlighted the dangers of food dependency and the devastating consequences of market-driven policies that put profits before people's well-being. It also shone a spotlight on the effects of British imperialism, which had already been a point of contention for many colonized nations. The world began to take a closer look at the treatment of impoverished populations, and the tragedy of the famine led to increased advocacy for social justice, humanitarian aid, and more equitable agricultural practices. While the Irish potato famine may have been a disaster of incomprehensible scale, it also acted as a catalyst for change on both a national and global level. The lessons learned from this dark chapter in history continue to influence policies on food security, the rights of the oppressed, and the importance of government responsibility in times of crisis. Today, as we reflect on the famine, we are reminded of how human-made tragedies can be caused by a mix of greed, neglect, and inequality, and how those tragedies, though painful, can also spark movements that fight for justice and human dignity. In Ireland, the memory of the potato famine continues to be a symbol of perseverance and hope. It reminds the Irish people, and indeed the world, that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there is always the possibility for renewal and change. The famine, with all its devastation, laid the groundwork for a stronger, more independent nation, in a more engaged and compassionate global community. Through the pain and the loss, Ireland found a renewed sense of purpose and identity, one that would go on to shape the country's future and its place in the world. As we conclude this story, we can't help but see the Irish potato famine as more than just a tragic event. It is a story of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. The famine not only shaped the course of Irish history, but it also shaped the world's understanding of hunger, colonization, and the need for social change. And in the end, it serves as a powerful reminder of the ways in which even the darkest moments can lead to brighter futures. Thank you for taking this journey through history with me, and I hope this story has given you a deeper understanding of one of the most devastating yet transformative events in Irish history,